Shabbat Shalom. The book of Leviticus sits at the very center of the Torah. And at the very center of Leviticus is a quest for order after the disorder left behind in Egypt. In the midst of the wilderness, an untamed place beyond human control, the Israelite priests sought to create an island of stability and predictability. As in the beginning, God brought order out of chaos, differentiating light from darkness and dry land from water, so also the priests are commanded to differentiate between the sacred and the profane, the pure and impure, creating a world that will sustain the community as it wanders toward the land of God's promise. This week's Parsha, Parshat Emor, exhorts and instructs the Israelites in the habits of holiness. We are taught, for example, that a priest may not come into contact with a dead body, that an animal with a blemish may not be offered to God as a sacrifice, that the year will be organized around a calendar of Mikrei Kodesh, sacred occasions and festivals. And Moore's stark worldview is reflected in its understanding of justice and punishment as well. At the end of the Parsha, we read the story of a young man who is condemned to death by God in just 4 verses. This man is the son of an Egyptian father and an Israelite woman, a woman by the name of Shlomit from the tribe of Dan. In the course of a fight with an Israelite man, the son of Shlomit curses God's name. He is taken into custody, and then, at God's command, he is stoned to death. This narrative is jarring in content. Even more discordant is its sudden appearance in the midst of this neatly organized list of rules and regulations, a scene of chaos breaking through the meticulously ordered world of Leviticus. And just as quickly as the shouts erupt, they are silenced by divine verdict. God instructs Moses to tell the Israelite community, anyone who blasphemes God's name shall bear the guilt, and one who also pronounces God's name shall be put to death. If anyone kills any human being, that person shall be put to death. One who kills a beast shall make restitution for it, life for life. If one maims another person, what was done shall be done in return. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That is the end of the blasphemer's story in the biblical text. It is a grim lesson in the consequences of cursing God's name. But in our tradition, that is not the end of the story. As with so many biblical stories, its life goes on in the Midrash. Curious about this man's origin and the circumstances of the fight, and perhaps troubled by God's verdict, our sages fill in the missing details of this story and point us toward an ethic of relationship, mutuality, and moral obligation. Stitching together several commentaries, we learn that this man's father was an Egyptian taskmaster and his mother was an Israelite slave. While some versions of this story portray Shlomit as welcoming the Egyptian into her tent, it's hard to imagine a female slave ever being in a position to reject the sexual advances of someone in power. Born of violence, Shlomit's son throws his lot in with the Israelites, his mother's family, leaving Egypt as a member of the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude who journeyed with the Israelites across the parted sea. This is how he learns the divine name, which he later curses. Midrash teaches that he stood at Sinai along with all of Israel, an heir to divine revelation. The sages explain also what led to his downfall. A fight broke out in the Israelite camp when he sought to pitch his tent alongside the tribe of Dan, his mother's tribe. He was rejected as an outsider, treated as a stranger because his father was not Israelite. When he appealed the ruling in Moses' court, he lost his case, and in response, he cursed God's name. The rabbinic imagination brings this nameless son of Shlomit vividly to life. Suddenly, he is real to us. We sense his pain. We empathize with his anger, provoked by an Israelite act of exclusion. The rabbis offer us a human story, an indictment of Israel, and perhaps a critique of divine judgment and justice. A life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, we read. The sages are troubled by this harsh structure of retribution and will replace it later with one of reparation and monetary compensation. My friend, the Reverend George Chochos, offers another take. He reads this ancient prescription for justice as a manual for teshuvah, for transformation, repair, and restoration. He teaches that if someone takes life, they are obligated to give life, to offer others a chance to live with dignity, to create the conditions for others to thrive and flourish. If you take sight, he says, you are obligated to open the eyes of other people, to offer a vision for healing and restoration. We see Reverend Chochos' words come alive in the rabbi's version of this biblical story. Where God and the Israelites took the life of the blasphemer, the sages give him life. They give him a story. They give him personhood and dignity. They give him emotions and motivation. He becomes much more than his sin. By telling his story, the sages help us imagine a different ending for him, an ending in which he is not shunned and killed, but instead embraced by his community. Imagine what he could have contributed to our people had he been pardoned, the lessons in resilience and moral agency he could have taught had he been offered another chance. The rabbinic reading of Parshat Emor prompts us to use our imagination and our courage, to step beyond bounded notions of who is in and who is out, to reimagine the vast webs of relationship that connect all of us, pointing us toward an ethic of compassion, dignity, and mutual responsibility. What are our ethical, and moral obligations to the people in our communities? What do we owe to those within and outside the Israelite camp? As we wander through the wilderness of our time, a world that sometimes resembles the stark binaries and polarities of Leviticus, may we seek to create holy spaces and practices which push us to sharpen and expand notions of belonging and obligation, of justice and humanity. May the sacred wisdom of our tradition and the stories of those around us sustain and propel us forward as we walk ever closer to the land of God's promise. Shabbat Shalom.